What do we think about big games in college football? Chris Fanini, I saw put out something earlier today. So, Colin, show me that tweet that Chris put out, and I want you to respond to this. So, he said, am I wrong that individual college football games today, or any sports, don't hold mythical status like they used to? Is it our attention span? Is it that there's just so many more games on TV that it's harder to stand out? I could today recount more great games from 2005 than 2023. Completely agree with him. Completely agree with him. So what happened? First off, do you feel this way? Or if you're of age where you can remember both of those periods, do you feel like games are every bit as big today as they used to be? I think there's something to be said that has nothing to do with sports, and that is with the proliferation and saturation of media and social media, you just have more stuff thrown at you. It's like a fire hose in your face. You get more information, you're exposed to more things today in one day than people in 1994 would be in a week or a month, which is wild to think about. So it's hard for any one thing to stand out. That's not just a sports thing. Like, there are things that happen in society. There are things that have happened within the last month or two in our country that entire documentaries would have been done on, and entire chapters of history books would be dedicated to if it happened 30 years ago. And it's like a month old, and oh yeah, that's right, that happened. Well, that happens in sports too. So that has nothing to do with sports themselves changing. However, there are a lot of things about the sport of college football that I think have changed that have contributed to this. And I am going to tell you right now, I got into it today with a number of people arguing about this, because what Chris was saying there is right. He was saying, man, these regular season games, like we got Georgia-Bama this weekend. He was talking about 2005, I think, and he was talking about how USC went to Notre Dame. And that's the year that Charlie Weiss had him grow the grass really high before Notre Dame inexplicably switched to synthetic turf. And I remember vividly being in my bedroom watching that game. I remember it. I don't remember a single regular season game just off the top of my head from like 2018 or 21, the way I do games back then. So it could just be that you romanticize the past, you romanticize the things that you saw as a kid, but some of you weren't kids in the mid-2000s. Some of you were 33 years old, and I guarantee you some of you feel the same way I do. So it's not merely romanticizing your childhood. What I think happened is those games in the pre-2000s, or those games in the mid-2000s, were in the pre-who's in era, as I like to call it. So it was before the advent of a playoff. We didn't have the playoff, and not just the playoff itself, but we didn't have the who's in era. I think one of the big faults of ESPN when they acquired that property, they have since backtracked and apologized for it and tried to rectify it to their credit, but damage was kind of done when they acquired that property of the playoff. It was every single commercial break of every single game, every single week from week one on, who's in, who's in, who's in. It was the marketing campaign. It was the marketing slogan of the playoff. So the who's in ideology came to be plastered all over the sport, and slowly the idea took root that meaning in college football and a game having meaning is no longer derived just from it being a Saturday in the fall. Now its meaning is derived from whether it has playoff implications attached to it. And the natural follow-up was, well, your games have meaning as long as you've got a shot at making the playoff. But if you don't have a shot at making the playoff, your games don't really have meaning anymore. And what that did was it fundamentally changed the way you watched college football games. Because it used to be a game like this Saturday, Georgia, Alabama, you put that thing back 20 years ago, it just exists. And its magnitude is its magnitude because of what it encapsulates in and of itself. It would be almost independent of what kind of postseason implications rode on it, because you hadn't even had your mind retrained to think in that way. There was a national title game back then, just as there is now. There was already an infrastructure of a postseason. But unlike pro sports, you weren't taught that that's the wagon, and then, or that's the horse, and then it pulls the wagon of the regular season along with it. It was the inverse. So I think that happened, and also then things started to be called meaningless that previously had not been called meaningless. You ever hear the phrase meaningless bowl game in 2005? I didn't. Meaningless regular season game? Like, could you imagine? That was like punishable by jail time in portions of the South, and should be still today if you said that. So then the follow-up, Colin, show me that next tweet, because I had a guy come at me. He didn't come at me, he just responded, and he said, Kids stopped playing in meaningless bowl games. So it had to play out this way, and honestly, I prefer this. The way it was before started with tons of meaningful games and ended with most fan bases checked out. This keeps almost everybody engaged. The expanded playoff keeps almost everybody engaged and gives us a December with great college football games. That's not the whole story. That's disingenuous. Respectfully, that's disingenuous. Fan bases weren't always checked out. Fan bases weren't checking out when they lost 2 games in 2005. Fan bases, believe it or not, kids, my college-age folks are not going to understand this, so I'm going to explain it to you. Believe it or not, once upon a time, if you entered the season, a bunch of folks wanted to win the national title. A bunch of fan bases had just as warped a perception of their team back then as they do now. And a bunch of folks who probably had no shot of winning a title had a goal to win a title. That's great. That's wonderful. No one ever told you to change it. But once upon a time, a fan base of a team would have a goal to win a national title. Their expectation would be 12-0, and then they'd lose a couple of early games. And believe it or not, what would happen is they didn't look at the rest of the season as meaningless. They simply recalibrated their expectation. And so every step along the way, you would take the expectation, and then you would observe the result, and then you'd recalibrate your expectation. And if you kept winning, your expectation didn't change. Your expectation is, we want to win a title, we think we can win a title, we're 9-0, we can still win the title. But if it started, we want to win a title, and we're 7-3, we want to make the Capital One Bowl. That sounds ludicrous today. Not too long ago, it was the way it worked, and it wasn't a bad thing. Those people weren't stupid. They weren't ignorant. A bunch of folks found happiness in understanding that, well, we didn't quite make it to the mountaintop. Like the top rung of the ladder will always be there. That's a championship. But there was value in the next rung or the rung below that. Like, how high on the ladder can we climb this year? Then someone came along and said, that top rung, keep it. The rest of them, doesn't matter. Rip them off. If you can't reach that top rung, everything else you do is meaningless. And people who supported that wanted to look at the folks who had believed in the old way of doing things and call them backwards. That's wild. Like that to me is still a wild concept. So the games weren't meaningless before. And to speak about the kids opting out of the bowl games, that's not how that happened. The kids didn't just all of a sudden up in one day say, I don't want to play bowl games anymore. What happened first was the adults in the room, as they often do, screwed it up. And they started presenting the idea that if your games don't have playoff implications, they're meaningless in the regular season. And if your bowl game's not part of the playoff, it's meaningless as well. Meaningless bowl game, meaningless regular season game, those are phrases that players didn't invent. Adults invented them. Some of them on campuses, some of them in TV studios, some of them online or on message boards, but the adults introduced it into the zeitgeist, and then the players said, I'm going to take you at your word. Maybe these are meaningless. I'm going to opt out. Don't leave chapter 1 of the book out. Tell the whole story on that. So I just want to, by the way, say that no one can go back and do anything about that, but I did want to respond to that. And I also want to tell you, we have our first case study this Saturday. In the new playoff era, we have a game coming up this Saturday. We'll be there, Alabama, Georgia, where nobody's going to get eliminated from anything by losing the game. There's a giant safety net under the game. How does it feel? Because I went at someone the other night a little bit, probably a little bit too hard, honestly, but I went at someone because they said this game's meaningless. What they were saying, in part, was kind of something that I agree with, at the macro level, and that is an expanded playoff devalues some of the high-level regular season games. I agree with that. Where I disagree on the micro level is that this game's meaningless. This game's not meaningless, whether you have a playoff or not, whether you have a 30-team playoff or not. However, we will find out together how we feel about this game. And we got to kind of feel it out. We've never been through this before, so we're going to kind of feel it out. We'll see.